The sun was descending lazily over the city park, casting golden light over the swaying trees and cobblestone paths. In the heart of this tranquil haven stood Villaggio, an exclusive restaurant that whispered opulence from every corner. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the air was perfumed with freshly baked bread and the faint hint of roses. At the center of it all sat Ethan Maxwell, a man whose very presence commanded respect. At 73, his silver hair and sharp features mirrored a lifetime of relentless ambition. Dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, his every gesture spoke of a man used to control, of his empire, his surroundings, and perhaps even people. Yet beneath his composed exterior lay something else, a weariness that lingered in his eyes, as if the weight of his vast fortune was now a burden he carried alone. Opposite him sat his wife, Sophia Maxwell, the picture of perfection. Her jet-black hair cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders, framing a face that could have graced any magazine cover. Her crimson lips parted slightly in a smile that felt practiced, her fingers toying with a diamond bracelet that caught the light with every flick. She exuded elegance, yet there was something calculated in her demeanor, a tension that only those who looked closely could detect. Their table was a tableau of indulgence, steaming soup served in fine china, artisanal bread still warm from the oven, and glasses of sparkling water that caught the sunlight like liquid diamonds. And yet, the atmosphere between them was far from warm. Beyond the restaurant's iron gates stood Liam, a boy who didn't belong in this world of luxury. His oversized hoodie hung limply on his wiry frame, and his dark eyes darted from table to table with the precision of someone used to surviving on scraps. He wasn't looking for pity, only opportunity. And when his gaze settled on Ethan and Sophia's table, his stomach tightened at the sight of food he hadn't tasted in months. But something deeper than hunger began to gnaw at Liam as he studied the couple. He couldn't explain it, but the way Sophia's smile never reached her eyes, the way Ethan seemed distant and distracted, it felt wrong, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface of their polished facade. Liam wasn't one to dwell on the lives of the wealthy, but he found himself unable to look away. Something about this moment, about these people, felt different. Little did he know, this day would push him into a dangerous game, one where the stakes were life and death, and even the smallest move could change everything. Inside Villaggio, the air was thick with the hum of muted conversations and the clinking of silverware. At the central table, Ethan Maxwell scrolled through his phone with slow, deliberate swipes. His brow furrowed slightly, though whether it was from the content on the screen or the tension across the table was unclear. Opposite him, Sophia Maxwell twirled her diamond bracelet with one hand, her other resting lightly on the edge of the table. Her gaze wandered lazily around the restaurant, but her expression betrayed a quiet restlessness. The practiced elegance in her movements clashed with the chill in her demeanor, like a porcelain doll, beautiful but hollow. "Are you even listening, Ethan?" Sophia's voice was light, almost melodic, but her words carried a sharp edge. Ethan didn't look up. "I'm here, aren't I?" he replied, his tone as flat as the screen he was staring at. Sophia's lips twitched, a smirk or a sneer. It was hard to tell. She leaned back in her chair, her posture perfect, but her eyes remained distant. Outside the restaurant, Liam stood motionless behind the wrought iron fence, his thin frame blending into the shadows. The aroma of food wafting through the air made his stomach churn with hunger. But Liam wasn't just hungry for bread and soup. He was hungry for a world he could never touch. His gaze locked on Ethan and Sophia. They looked like they had it all: wealth, power, the kind of life Liam could only imagine. Yet even from a distance he could see cracks in their glossy facade. The way Ethan barely acknowledged Sophia, the way she fiddled with her bracelet as though it were her only anchor to reality. The food on their table caught his eye. A steaming bowl of soup sat untouched beside a perfectly arranged loaf of bread. The sight of it made his throat tighten. It had been days since Liam had eaten anything more substantial than stale crackers he'd scavenged from a trash bin. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. A cocktail of emotions surged through him: longing, bitterness, and something darker, a quiet rage at the unfairness of it all. How could they sit there, surrounded by so much, while people like him fought for crumbs? Liam considered turning away, burying his anger and letting the moment pass. But something stopped him. There was an unease in the air, a strange heaviness he couldn't shake. The way Sophia glanced at Ethan when he wasn't looking, the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. It made the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stand up. His stomach growled, pulling him back to the moment. Hunger, desperation, and instinct battled within him, but his attention kept returning to that table. To Ethan, scrolling through his phone, oblivious. To Sophia, twirling her bracelet with the faintest hint of a smirk curling at the edge of her lips. Something wasn't right. Liam couldn't explain it, but the feeling gnawed at him, sharper than any hunger pang. And so, he stayed, watching, waiting. As the golden light of the afternoon began to dim, Liam stood rooted in place, not knowing that the decision to linger would soon throw him into a storm far greater than he could imagine. The soft hum of conversation and the clatter of utensils filled the air inside Villaggio, but at Ethan and Sophia Maxwell's table, a tense silence lingered. Ethan remained engrossed in his phone, his brows furrowed as if the screen contained answers to unspoken questions. Across from him, Sophia's carefully painted smile faltered, replaced by a calculating expression that she quickly masked with a casual flick of her wrist. Her hand slipped into her designer handbag with practiced ease, emerging moments later with a small vial. The glass shimmered faintly in the sunlight, and the clear liquid inside seemed innocuous, ordinary even. But Sophia's movements were anything but. She glanced at Ethan, ensuring his attention was firmly on the device in his hands. Her fingers worked quickly, twisting the vial open with a near-silent pop. With a flick of her wrist, the liquid poured into Ethan's steaming bowl of soup. It disappeared almost instantly, swallowed by the rich golden broth as if it had never been there. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her expression calm, her lips curling into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. She reached for her glass of water, her demeanor as poised and composed as ever. Outside the iron fence, Liam's stomach dropped. He had seen everything. At first he doubted his own eyes. Could she have just done what he thought she did? It seemed impossible. Something out of a crime drama, not real life. Yet the deliberate nature of her actions left no room for ambiguity. Sophia Maxwell, with her flawless beauty and designer elegance, had just poisoned her husband's food. Liam's breath hitched. His instincts screamed for him to turn away, to mind his own business. He had spent years blending into the background, surviving by being invisible. This was not his fight. But then came the memories. He remembered the countless times he had been ignored when he needed help the most. The cold, indifferent stares of strangers as he begged for scraps on street corners. The way people averted their eyes, pretending not to see him, as if his existence was an inconvenience. Liam's fists clenched at his sides. Was he going to become one of them now? Just another silent witness to something terrible? He glanced back at Ethan, oblivious as he idly stirred his soup with a silver spoon. Time seemed to slow. Liam's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed the urgency of the moment. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his body trembling with indecision. His mind raced with questions. What if no one believed him? What if they threw him out of the restaurant for causing a scene? What if he was wrong? But deep down, Liam knew he wasn't wrong. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and the cold detachment in Sophia's expression confirmed it. This wasn't just about Ethan Maxwell. It was about doing what was right, about standing up for someone, even when it was terrifying. Liam swallowed hard, his throat dry. Every fiber of his being wanted to run, but he forced himself to stay. The tension at the table was palpable. Ethan Maxwell, unaware of the storm brewing around him, absent-mindedly swirled his spoon in the steaming bowl of soup. The rich aroma wafted upwards, a perfect blend of spices and decadence. Slowly, he lifted the spoon to his lips, ready to take his first taste. Outside, Liam felt his heart race as he watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like an eternity. The image of Sophia pouring the liquid into the soup played over and over in his mind, fueling his resolve. He knew this was the moment. If he didn't act now, it would be too late. Without thinking, Liam's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He ducked through the iron gate and bolted towards the table, his voice erupting in a frantic shout. "Don't eat that!" The restaurant seemed to freeze in time. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, forks clattered onto plates, and a glass somewhere tipped over, spilling water across a pristine white tablecloth. Every head turned toward Liam as he stood there, panting, his thin frame trembling with adrenaline. Ethan's spoon hovered inches from his mouth, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence heavy and suffocating. Sophia was the first to react. Her face twisted into a mask of feigned confusion and indignation. She pushed her chair back slightly, her movements sharp and deliberate, and turned her icy gaze on Liam. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice a chilling blend of disbelief and anger. "Who let this boy in here?" Liam's chest heaved as he pointed a shaking finger at the bowl of soup. "She put something in it," he blurted out, his voice loud but uneven. "I saw her. She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking." A wave of gasps rippled through the diners, whispers breaking the silence like cracks in glass. Ethan blinked, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the spoon back to the bowl. He turned to Sophia, his expression a mixture of confusion and skepticism. "Sophia," he said cautiously, his voice calm but with an edge of uncertainty. "What is he talking about?" Sophia's composure cracked for only a fraction of a second before she regained control. She let out a soft, mocking laugh, shaking her head as though she couldn't believe the absurdity of it all. "He's just a street kid," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Probably looking for attention or a quick handout. Look at him. Do you really think someone like that would know what he's talking about?" Liam's fists clenched at her words, the sting of her dismissal cutting deep. But he stood his ground, meeting Ethan's gaze with desperation in his eyes. "I'm not lying," he said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "I saw her. She's trying to hurt you." The room held its collective breath. Ethan's gaze shifted between Liam and Sophia, doubt flickering across his face. His hand rested on the table, fingers lightly drumming against the wood as though weighing the truth in his mind. "Is this true?" he asked Sophia, his voice low and measured, but with a hint of something darker beneath. Betrayal, perhaps, or the fear of it. Sophia's expression hardened. "Of course it's not true," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "This is ridiculous, Ethan. He's just making things up to cause a scene." But the intensity in Liam's eyes told a different story. "Please," Liam begged, taking a step closer. "Just don't eat it. If you don't believe me, have someone else test it. But don't eat that soup." The restaurant was silent again, the weight of Liam's words hanging in the air. For the first time, Ethan hesitated, his composure slipping. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed the bowl of soup away from him. Sophia's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. The mask of calm elegance she had worn so carefully all evening was beginning to crack. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan Maxwell sat rigid in his chair, his fingers pressed against the edge of the table as if steadying himself. The untouched bowl of soup sat between him and Sophia like an unspoken accusation. His sharp, calculating eyes turned to Liam, who stood trembling but defiant. "Start from the beginning," Ethan said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of command. Liam swallowed hard, his throat dry, but his resolve did not falter. "I saw her," he began, pointing to Sophia with a trembling finger. She took a small glass vial out of her purse. It had clear liquid in it. She opened it, poured it into your soup, and stirred it while you were on your phone. I swear, I saw everything. The room filled with hushed whispers, the low murmur of disbelief and intrigue spreading like wildfire. Diners leaned toward one another, exchanging wide-eyed glances as their attention flickered between the boy, Sophia, and Ethan. Sophia's face hardened as she slammed her hand on the table, silencing the murmurs nearby. "This is preposterous," she snapped, her voice cutting through the tension. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the table as her eyes burned with indignation. "You're going to believe this. This street urchin. He's clearly lying." Liam didn't flinch, his voice gaining strength despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm not lying," he insisted, taking a step closer to the table. "Why would I make this up? I saw her do it. She was careful, but I noticed." Ethan turned his gaze to Sophia, his expression unreadable. "Sophia," he said slowly. "What's going on?" Sophia let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head as though the absurdity of the situation was beneath her. "What's going on is that this boy is making things up to get attention. Or maybe money. Isn't that what people like him always want?" She sneered, crossing her arms. "Look at him, Ethan. Do you really think he's credible?" The din in the restaurant grew louder, the whispers now laced with speculation. "Did you see her face just now?" one diner murmured to another. "She seems nervous," another whispered back. "But why would she do it?" came a hushed reply. Sophia's lips tightened as the weight of the room's growing suspicion pressed down on her. Her polished composure began to crack, the poised elegance replaced by a simmering rage barely held in check. Liam stepped forward again, his hands clenched into fists. "Check her bag," he said firmly, his eyes locking with Ethan's. "If you don't believe me, just check. The vial might still be there." Sophia's eyes widened for the briefest moment before narrowing into a glare. "Don't you dare!" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Ethan noticed the flicker of panic and leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. "You're unusually defensive for someone who claims to have nothing to hide," he said, his voice quieter now but cutting nonetheless. The murmurs in the room turned into a low roar of speculation. Sophia glanced around, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. For the first time, her carefully constructed facade was crumbling under the weight of the scrutiny. "Enough!" she finally snapped, rising from her chair. Her sudden movement caused her napkin to fall to the floor, unnoticed. "I won't sit here and be humiliated by this nonsense." But Ethan didn't flinch. "Sit down, Sophia," he commanded, his voice as cold as ice. She froze, the authority in his tone rooting her in place. The room fell silent again, every diner holding their breath. The tension in the room was suffocating. All eyes were on Sophia Maxwell, who stood frozen in place, her meticulously crafted poise crumbling with every passing second. The whispers of the diners had grown into an audible murmur, like the hum of an approaching storm. Ethan Maxwell sat still, his gaze locked on his wife, a mix of disbelief and dread etched into his face. "Say something, Sophia," Ethan demanded, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried more weight than a shout ever could. Sophia opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, an escape, anything. But all she saw were accusing stares and murmuring lips. Her breathing quickened, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist jingled faintly as her trembling hand clutched the back of her chair. She stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment. Ethan leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Did you do it, Sophia?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Sophia closed her eyes tightly, as if willing the moment to disappear. When she opened them again, tears were brimming, but they weren't born of remorse. They were of rage and frustration. "Yes!" she screamed, her voice slicing through the thick silence. The room collectively gasped, and a wave of shock rippled through the crowd. "Yes, I did it! Are you happy now?" Ethan's face went pale, the blood draining from his features as if the confession had physically struck him. For a moment he seemed lost, his composure shattered. Sophia's voice grew louder, more erratic, as the words tumbled out in a torrent. "I'm tired of living in your shadow, Ethan. Everything is about you, your empire, your decisions, your power, and I'm just supposed to sit there smiling, looking pretty, while you control every aspect of my life." Her words dripped with venom, each syllable laced with years of pent-up resentment. The room was deathly silent, save for the faint sound of someone's fork clattering to the floor. "You're impossible, Ethan," she spat, her tears streaming now. "You never even noticed. I've been suffocating for years and you didn't care. All I wanted was a chance to take back control, to have something for myself. But you just sit there, like a king on his throne, oblivious to everyone around you." Ethan stared at her, his mouth slightly open, as though he couldn't quite process the words. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "You tried to kill me. For money." Sophia laughed bitterly, wiping her cheeks. "For freedom, Ethan. For a life that wasn't dictated by you." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps broke through the tension. 2 police officers entered the restaurant, their uniforms stark against the opulent backdrop. A waiter pointed towards Sophia, and they made their way to her with purpose. "Mrs. Maxwell," one of the officers said firmly, "we need you to come with us." Sophia's head snapped toward the officers, her panic palpable. "Wait, no, this is a misunderstanding," she shouted, backing away. "Ethan, tell them I didn't mean it. It was just a mistake." But Ethan said nothing. His expression was hollow, his gaze fixed on the table as though he couldn't bring himself to look at her. The officers moved swiftly, their hands firm but not rough as they restrained her. "You don't understand," Sophia screamed, struggling against their grip. "I deserved more. I deserved everything he has." As they led her away, her voice echoed through the restaurant, filled with rage and desperation. "You'll regret this, Ethan. You'll see. You'll all see." The restaurant had begun to return to its usual rhythm. Waiters moved cautiously between tables, whispering amongst themselves, while diners murmured about the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. But at the center of it all, Ethan Maxwell remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his eyes distant. His mind swirled with emotions, betrayal, anger, disbelief. But amidst the storm of thoughts, one thing stood out with clarity: the boy. Ethan turned his gaze to Liam, who lingered a few feet away, his shoulders tense as if bracing for rejection. The boy's face was pale but determined, his dark eyes watching Ethan carefully, ready to bolt at the slightest sign of trouble. "Come here," Ethan said, his voice quieter than usual but steady. Liam hesitated, glancing nervously at the diners still stealing glances in their direction. Slowly, he took a step forward, his movements cautious, like a stray animal unsure if it could trust the outstretched hand of a stranger. Ethan gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Liam hesitated again, but eventually slid into the seat, his posture stiff. He kept his eyes fixed on Ethan, his wariness palpable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "You saved my life," he said simply. Liam shrugged, his voice quiet but firm. "I just did what I thought was right." Ethan studied the boy, his gaze softening. "You did more than that. Most people wouldn't have said a word. They'd have looked the other way, kept their heads down. But you..." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "You stood up, even when you knew no one might believe you." Liam shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the praise. "I wasn't looking for anything. I just..." He hesitated, then added, "I couldn't let her hurt you." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's why I want to help you." Liam's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Help me? Why?" "Not out of pity," Ethan said firmly, anticipating the boy's reaction. "I know how much you hate that. I'm offering because you've earned it. Because the world needs more people like you, Liam. People who don't just stand by and watch." Liam blinked, his skepticism wavering. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Ethan continued, "that I want to make sure you never have to struggle like this again. I can give you a place to stay, food, a chance to build something for yourself, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Liam said nothing. His defenses were still up, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Hope, hesitant but undeniable. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." Ethan smiled for the first time that evening, a small but genuine gesture. Good. Let's start with a meal. The weight of the evening began to lift as the restaurant staff returned to their routines, and the lingering crowd finally turned back to their meals. At the center of it all, Liam sat at the table across from Ethan Maxwell, still trying to process everything that had just happened. For the first time in years, Liam felt something unfamiliar, a spark of hope. His life had been a blur of shadows and survival, where invisibility was his shield. But tonight, he was seen. Not as a nuisance or a beggar, but as someone who mattered. The warmth of Ethan's words echoed in his mind. The world needs more people like you. It wasn't just the promise of a place to stay or food on his plate. It was the validation, the acknowledgement of his courage that ignited something deep within him. Ethan sat back in his chair, watching the boy. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now held a softer light. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of reading people, yet he had overlooked the very humanity in those who existed on the fringes. Liam's selflessness was a stark contrast to the hollow opulence that had surrounded Ethan for decades. "You know," Ethan said after a moment, breaking the silence, "I built everything I have by trusting my instincts. But I also made mistakes that cost me more than money ever could. Tonight, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Liam tilted his head, curious. "What's that?" "That the world isn't just about power and wealth. Sometimes it's the people who have the least who show us what truly matters." Liam didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. But deep down, his chest swelled with a quiet pride. As the evening wore on, the two sat in a comfortable silence. The stark divide between their worlds, Liam's life of struggle and Ethan's of abundance, seemed to fade, replaced by a shared understanding. Outside the restaurant, the city lights twinkled against the darkened sky, casting long shadows across the park. The chaos of the night was over, but its impact lingered. For Ethan, it was a turning point, a lesson that no amount of money or status could teach. Empathy has the power to bridge even the widest gaps. And for Liam, it was a chance, a rare, precious chance, to step out of the shadows and into a life he never thought possible. The story closed on a simple yet profound truth. Acts of courage and kindness, no matter how small, can ripple out to create change far greater than imagined. It was a reminder that in a world often consumed by greed and indifference, there is still power in doing what is right, even when it's the hardest thing to do. Did this story move you? Could you feel the tension, the courage, and the life-changing power of one simple act of bravery? If you were in Liam's shoes, what would you have done? Or if you were Ethan, how would you respond to such a profound act of kindness from a stranger? Take a moment to reflect and share your thoughts with us in the comments. Your feedback helps us improve and inspires us to bring you even more compelling stories. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share it with your friends, and let them experience the power of doing what's right. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next incredible tale waiting just around the corner. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We wish you a wonderful day filled with inspiration, and may you always find the courage to stand up for what's right.